It's time for Insights, a video news production of Deloitte LLP. Now here's your host, Sean O'Grady.
Hello and welcome to Insights. Today's topic is the Chief Compliance Officer of the Future. And with us in New York for this discussion are Tom Rollauer, the former Chief Compliance Officer of Citigroup, who is now also a director at Deloitte & Touche. And we have Jeffrey Williams, the Vice President of Compliance at Pfizer. So, gentlemen, I know that we're going to be talking about the role of compliance in the future, but I'd like to begin by taking a look back before we go forward. And since clearly you've both been in the role, Tom, how do you feel like that job has changed, say, 2000 to 2010, the past decade?
Sean, the position of Chief Compliance Officer has changed dramatically over the last decade. Given the plethora of regulations that we had that put in place over that time period, it had significant impact on corporate America. Starting with the Patriot Act in 2001 after the 9/11 crisis, and then most recently the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. Significant regulations coming out of all that legislation. And that falls primarily on the shoulders of the Chief Compliance Officer of a corporation. That person has the responsibility of ensuring that the company is in compliance with laws, regulations, and internal policies. So it's a major task undertaking to get that right and to be able to demonstrate to the regulators that you're in control, and to your stakeholders, the board, shareholders, senior management. So the role of the Chief Compliance Officer has been elevated because of this important role and the visibility that it has now with the stakeholders, including the regulators. And so the Chief Compliance Officer is now an official member of the C-suite, if you will, whereas in the past it was sort of a sub-part of the legal division in most cases. It is now in the spotlight, and the Chief Compliance Officer has to put in place a very comprehensive and robust compliance program to take into consideration all these new requirements and to stay ahead of the curve and anticipate new requirements coming down the road. So the role has changed dramatically in concert with the increased regulations and the standards that the regulators expect of a Chief Compliance Officer. In the financial services sector, for example, the Federal Reserve Board has put in place minimum guidelines for the enterprise-wide compliance program for large, complex banking institutions. And they examine the function against those requirements. So the standards have been raised, the bar is high, and so the Chief Compliance Officer has to make that all come together in a comprehensive way.
How about you, Jeff? Would you say that your view and experience is in line with that?
I would say it is. I agree with everything Tom has said. I think it's become particularly challenging, and if I look at the evolution of compliance functions in the biopharmaceutical industry in particular, 10 years ago the industry was really just getting started in a lot of ways in developing its compliance programs. And now the challenge and the expectations have evolved to a point where there's a very strong expectation that the Chief Compliance Officer is going to be on top of key risks in all facets of the business, starting with research and manufacturing, all the way through marketing and promotion. And it's a very challenging task, especially in a global environment. Regulations are increasingly developing and are a continued area of focus. It's a continued area of focus for law enforcement, and with evolving notions of corporate responsibility and individual responsibility that you see in an environment where there is law enforcement scrutiny, regulatory scrutiny. It's tremendously challenging. And when you add to that the fact that businesses are very innovative and are always looking for new ways to carry out operations, new avenues for revenue, strategic partnerships, joint ventures in emerging markets, it becomes a challenge and a key responsibility for the Chief Compliance Officer to make sure you're one step ahead of the potential risks resulting from business innovation. So you really need to be as innovative with your compliance program as your business is with its operational programs.
I liked your use of the word innovative, because if we look at the marketplace and if we look at your roles respectively, this seems to be one of those critical junctures. Dodd-Frank, Volcker, the changes in the U.S. healthcare system. I'm interested to know from the two of you and your experience, have you overseen compliance at a time of change, at a time of that shift? And if so, how did you manage that opportunity and make it successful for yourselves?
Well, we continue to oversee compliance at a time of dramatic change. And I think the key to managing it is moving from focusing on individual compliance problems or issues and solving those issues to really creating an environment where you're working with the business as a key partner to identify potential significant compliance risks that may come out of developing a revolving business strategy, or in the way that strategy is being, as a result of it being operationalized. And I think it's particularly important to really be embedded with your business partners to understand what those risks might be, so that you can work together and collaborate on figuring out how to address unknown risks or emerging risks before they become a significant compliance program that you then need to remediate and correct on a retrospective basis. If it's gotten to that point, your program is not going to be successful. You're going to be successful to the extent you understand where your business is going, you're staying in tune with them and their innovation, you're matching their innovation with a compliance plan that's designed to identify the risks, get those risks on the table with the key business leaders so that they can be addressed appropriately and they don't become significant compliance issues.
Thank you for that. Tom, same question over to you, making the most of that opportunity.
Sure. Clearly, about 10 years ago, the compliance function was very much silo-driven by business. There was a compliance officer per business, if you will, and had a team in place to oversee the compliance risks of that particular business. What we've evolved to now is more of an enterprise-wide approach, where you need uniformity in terms of being able to gather information in a consistent fashion and be able to escalate it to the board and senior management, and be able to voice and present the state of compliance for that organization. In the past, again, very silo-driven, so you didn't have that enterprise-wide view. And so what many institutions have done, and in my prior life as a chief compliance officer, we created an overall global compliance policy which laid out the roles and responsibilities for the 3 lines of defense. And the first line is clearly the business managers themselves that manage the day-to-day risks. The second line of defense would be the compliance function, the independent compliance function in this case. And the third line of defense is internal audit. But all those 3 lines of defense each have a primary role and responsibility in managing compliance risks. So oftentimes you hear compliance is everyone's responsibility. So having a global policy in place that lays out the roles and responsibilities and then driving it down into the various businesses and geographies that you're in is key to a successful compliance program, because you need to have information bubble back up to the top and escalate in a uniform way, and to be able to manage that information and make course corrections as necessary. And the key to a compliance risk management program, the centerpiece, is a compliance risk assessment. As Jeff was saying, you need to be able to identify the risks associated with non-compliance with a given law or regulation. What's the inherent risk associated with that? And that's driven by the nature of your business, the volumes, et cetera, and the exposures that you have. And then what are the controls over that inherent risk? And then what's the residual risk that remains? And are you willing to live with that residual risk on a go-forward basis? So you need that knowledge to be able to manage compliance risk uniformly and on an enterprise-wide basis.
To the point that Tom is raising, I think it's critical for the Chief Compliance Officer and the compliance program to really be plugged into and embedded with the enterprise risk management program that's been established at the company, or to establish a program, because then you're going to be in a position where you're collaborating with all your enabling functions, your financial functions, your business and commercial functions, to really figure out on a company-wide basis what are the key risks that we're facing as a result of the way we do business as a company. And then you can use the enterprise risk management tool as a way to focus resources and efforts around ensuring that those key areas of risks do not become systemic compliance problems, because you have business leaders at the table, you have the attention of your board, you have the attention of senior leadership around understanding what these risks might be, and then having a plan in place, and also to Tom's point, with specific accountabilities that tie back into the business units for making sure that there are not systemic compliance issues or risks as a result of the review.
I think you touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to explore it some more, and that is we're talking about breaking down silos, we're talking about collaborating more across the enterprise, we're talking about being more intelligent about risk across the enterprise. Do you have any suggestions, drawing upon your experience, on how folks in your role could go about doing that?
Mm-hmm. Sure, and it really starts with the tone at the top of an organization. So the chief compliance officer and the board and senior management have to be on the same page. So it's important for the chief compliance officer to really strengthen those relationships at the top of the house. And they will have exposure to the board independently on a regular basis. So having that bond between the senior level management team and the board and the chief compliance officer to be able to take the journey together and to drive that message down into the organization. To again create this risk-based approach to compliance risk management. There's so many laws and regulations out there, you have to be able to prioritize them and to understand what could impact your organization the most. So that's important to have that compliance, risk-based compliance risk framework in place. And then also because this involves a lot of resources to get this right. But you have to be able to create efficiencies along the way and to be able to leverage, as Jeff was mentioning, the enterprise risk management framework that's usually in place already to deal with the other risks within the organization, whether it's credit risk, market risk, or operational risk, to leverage that framework so that you don't reinvent the wheel. But compliance is very unique in terms of you're dealing with the law and the regulations that go with it. And so it's a different type of risk, and it has lots of corollary risks attached to it, specifically reputational risk. So if you have a non-compliance situation and you get in the headlines, think of what that does to your business. So it's about preventing reputational risk and working with the business to make sure they understand it. So the risk intelligent CCO, if you will, needs to be aware of the importance of the function, the need to leverage existing infrastructure, and to work closely with the top of the house to get it right.
And I think the risk intelligent CCO is also in a position to continuously monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of the compliance program. Once you've put your program in place and you're focused on the key elements that Tom has described, you need to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of that program. You need to be able to draw on metrics and information from the organization, coming from the bottom up, coming from the top down, to really understand, is your program as effective as you need it to be? And then you need to be open to and not afraid to challenge how effective that program is by bringing in outsiders, by bringing in independent legal counsel, by bringing in independent auditors and others in order to assess whether you have a compliance program that is going to be successful at addressing the types of risk that you're facing. So you always need to be open to monitoring and evaluating the quality of the program, because your business leaders are going to evolve in their thinking and approaches to how they bring in revenue and what strategies that they're operationalizing. So it's important to be a part of the development of those strategies and a part of evaluating and understanding how those strategies are actually working in the field with your sales force, with key business partners that you may be in a joint venture with in an emerging market where the risks might be higher than in certain other markets. Being open to evaluating and understanding risk on a continuous basis is also a very important thing for the risk intelligent compliance officer.
Now, we've been talking about implementing initiatives, but as the adage goes, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. And so since the two of you have been in this role, have had the opportunity to implement things, there's pitfalls, there's roadblocks, there's barriers. And so for folks in your role, I'm interested to look around the corner with you. What do you see coming as potential pitfalls, and what would be your recommendations for folks trying to implement a compliance process?
I think that the whole notion of pitfalls in this context is very interesting, because much of what we do is judged with the benefit of hindsight. And hindsight is an absolutely brutal judge. And I think the most successful compliance programs going forward are some of the most successful compliance programs will be the ones where the chief compliance officer has established with the board of directors and with senior leadership the value proposition of understanding risk and being in a position to mitigate those risks to prevent what might otherwise be huge compliance problems that really could sidetrack the business in a way that would be extremely detrimental from a legal perspective, from a public relations or publicity perspective, as Tom mentioned earlier. I think the more a chief compliance officer can work on developing relationships with key business leaders and understanding how the business works, listening very closely about how business plans are being operationalized, you're really going to stand the best prospect of success if you're doing those things.
Tom, final thoughts to you?
I think one of the key pitfalls, if you will, is to get complacent about your program. You've built this great enterprise-wide compliance program. It has to be continuously refreshed. And Dodd-Frank is a great example. We have a brand new regulation facing the financial services industry. You have to be able to anticipate that, to understand what's happening in the legislative process, and to start to communicate internally as to what the impact will be for the organization and how we will deal with that going forward. And so get ready for new changes in regulations. Keep it fresh, as I said, and also as the, partnering up with the business, because as the first line of defense, they have processes in place, and you need to continually provide training and awareness to the business to make sure they understand the importance of compliance risk and how they need to continually manage it through the self-assessment process and quality assurance processes and other techniques. And then team up with the other control functions, risk management, finance, operations and technology, to make sure that you share this important responsibility in ensuring compliance risk. And at the end of the day, internal audit also needs to play a role in validating the program to make sure that you have leading practices in place and that you're anticipating what's coming around the corner.
So now that we've changed, get ready to change again.
Right.
Gentlemen,
Precisely.
thank you both for your time today.
Thank you.
We've been talking about the Chief Compliance Officer of the Future with Tom Rollauer, a director in Deloitte & Touche, and Jeffrey Williams, Vice President of Compliance for Pfizer. If you'd like to learn more about Tom, Jeffrey, or the topics discussed on this broadcast, you can find that information on our website. It's deloitte.com/insightsus. For all the good folks here at Insights, I'm Sean O'Grady. We'll see you next time.